My best friend announced she's pregnant and it might be my husband's, but I don't blame them. That's because I had a secret of my own that only my best friend Lola knew about. You see, I had a miscarriage 3 years ago. My husband never knew I'd gotten pregnant because the week I found out was the week I lost the baby. I was devastated and blamed myself, but I was happy knowing I at least had my best friend. For weeks, she comforted me, telling me everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't okay. The miscarriage broke something in me. Every time I thought about getting pregnant again, I felt this overwhelming fear. What if it happened again? What if I couldn't handle losing another baby? So when my husband started talking about raising kids together, I came up with excuses. I'd say I wasn't ready. Let's wait until we're more financially stable. The hope in his eyes faded with every excuse I made, and I felt terrible. But I couldn't tell him the truth. I didn't want him to hurt the way I did. Until last month, when he sat me down on the couch and asked directly if I even wanted to have kids with him. I frowned. You know I do. It's just, I'm so close to getting that promotion and there's always going to be an excuse, isn't there? He cut me off and looked at me with a hurt expression. Sometimes I feel like you don't want a future with me at all. My chest squeezed painfully. I should have told him the truth right then. Instead, I just sat in silence. He waited for me to say something. Anything. When I didn't, he grabbed his keys and left. He became more distant after, always out, barely coming home, always saying that he needed to drive around and think. And I believed him. I gave him the space he needed until I started noticing things. He started dressing up nicer than before, like he was going on a date and not hanging out with friends. His phone bill was racking up hours and hours of calls and texts to an unknown caller. His credit card showed he was constantly buying flowers and gifts that he never once brought home, not even for our anniversary. And when I saw the long blonde hair on his jacket, I knew for sure he was cheating on me. I just didn't know with whom until last week. I decided to follow him. He said he was going to the gym, but I watched him get in his car and drive the opposite direction, all the way to a nice restaurant downtown. I parked across the street and watched him go inside. Through the window, I saw her, my best friend Lola, sitting across from my husband. She giggled while he pressed kisses on her hand, the same way he used to do with me when we started dating. I took photos on my phone and cried for a couple of minutes in the car, heartbroken and unable to process what I'd just seen. When I got home, I was angry and hurt and guilty, thinking my lie forced my husband to have an affair. But with my best friend, the girl who patted my back during my miscarriage, the person I trusted the most in the world, other things started coming together. The days where both Lola and my husband didn't respond to my calls. The days I was sure I'd seen her phone light up with a text from my husband's number saying, "Missing you already." All those late nights and suspicious excuses, all while Lola told me not to worry about my husband, to give him space, and that everything would be all right. She'd been backstabbing me. Both of them were backstabbing me. I spent 2 days thinking about how to confront them. Then my phone rang. It was Lola. "I have amazing news," she said. She sounded giddy. "Can I come over?" That's when everything came crumbling down. Hard. Lola showed up 20 minutes later with a bottle of champagne. My husband stared at her with a pale face, clearly confused about why she was here. "It's great to have friends around," she said, walking into the kitchen to grab 2 champagne flutes, one for me and one for my husband. My husband looked at the glasses. "You brought over champagne and you're not drinking?" he asked. She flashed a huge grin. "I can't drink anymore," she said. "Because I'm pregnant." My husband and I froze. "Who's the father?" I asked anxiously, even though I knew the answer. Lola's smile faltered for just a second. Then she looked directly at my husband, took his hand, and said in a happy tone, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." My husband pulled his hand back, staring at us with wide eyes. "It can't be mine," he said in a shaking voice. I wanted to know why we haven't had kids yet after being married for 3 years, so I went to a clinic and got tested. I got the results last week." He took a deep breath. "I'm infertile. I can't have children." The room went silent. Lola's face went from confused to panicked, then back to confused when she looked up at me. "Wait, if your husband's infertile, then how did you get pregnant and miscarry 3 years ago?" The secret was out. Nobody moved. The champagne bottle sat on the coffee table with little water drops running down the glass, and I watched one drip hit the wood surface while my brain tried to catch up with what just happened. My husband's face had gone totally white, like all the blood drained out of it, and his mouth hung open a little bit. Lola's big smile from 30 seconds ago had completely collapsed, and her eyes kept jumping back and forth between me and my husband, trying to figure out how her happy pregnancy news just blew up my 3-year lie. My husband turned toward me really slow, and the look on his face made my stomach drop. I saw him putting the pieces together in real time. Why I always had an excuse when he brought up kids. Why I changed the subject every single time. Why I got weird and quiet whenever someone at a restaurant had a baby. His eyes got wet and his jaw clenched tight, and I knew he was thinking about all those times I made him feel like I didn't want a future with him, when really I was just too scared to try again. Lola took a step backward toward the front door and her purse strap slipped off her shoulder. She caught it and hugged it against her chest. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before any sound came out, and when it did, her voice shook. She said something about needing to go, that this wasn't the right time, that she should leave us alone to talk. But my husband held up his hand and told her to wait. His voice came out rough and strange. He said we all needed to stay right here and figure out what was happening because clearly nobody had been telling the truth about anything. I made myself talk even though my throat felt tight and my hands were shaking. The words came out quiet at first, then a little louder as I forced myself to keep going. I told my husband I got pregnant 3 years ago. I told him I found out on a Tuesday and lost the baby that same week. I told him I was so broken and scared that I couldn't make myself tell him, because I didn't want him to hurt the way I was hurting. My voice cracked when I explained that every time he talked about having kids, all I could think about was losing another baby and not being able to survive it. The fear had taken over everything, and instead of being honest, I just kept making excuses and pushing him away. Lola's voice cut through the room, louder than before and going higher at the end. She asked how I could have been pregnant if my husband was infertile. She said it didn't make sense, that something was wrong with the timeline or the story. My husband pulled his phone out of his pocket and his hand shook so bad he almost dropped it. He tapped the screen a bunch of times, then turned it around so both Lola and I could see. It was a medical summary from some fertility clinic, and there were words highlighted in yellow that I didn't totally understand. Azoospermia. No viable sperm detected. The report showed 3 different test dates from the past month, and every single one said the same thing. The math hit all of us at the same time. Lola's face changed from confused to totally panicked in about 2 seconds flat. Her mouth opened and her eyes went wide, and I watched her realize that everyone in this room now knew for sure the baby couldn't be my husband's. She started talking really fast, saying maybe the test results were wrong, that medical tests make mistakes all the time. She said maybe she got her dates mixed up about when she got pregnant, that she wasn't totally sure about the timing. But my husband interrupted her before she could keep going. He asked her straight out if she slept with someone else. His voice was flat and cold, nothing like how he usually talked. Lola grabbed her purse tighter and backed up until she hit the door frame. She didn't answer the question. She just shook her head and said she couldn't do this right now, that it was too much. She turned around and yanked the front door open so hard it bounced off the wall. I heard her footsteps running down the front path, then her car door slamming, then the engine starting up. The champagne bottle was still sitting there on the coffee table, and the 2 empty glasses she'd gotten out for us. All the evidence of what was supposed to be a happy celebration, except now it just looked like proof of how messed up everything had become. My husband and I stood there in the terrible quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and a car driving past outside. Neither of us moved or said anything for a long time. I wanted to explain more, to make him understand why I lied, but my brain felt fuzzy and slow. He just stared at the spot where Lola had been standing, his face still pale and his jaw still tight. I counted the seconds in my head. 15, 30, 45. The silence got heavier and heavier until it felt like something solid pressing down on both of us. After what felt like forever but was probably only 20 minutes, my husband finally spoke. He said we needed to talk in the morning when we weren't so shocked and could actually think straight. His voice sounded tired and far away. He walked past me without looking at my face, went to the hallway closet and pulled out a pillow and one of the spare blankets. He carried them to the guest room and shut the door without saying goodnight or anything else. I heard the lock click. I went to our bedroom and lay down on top of the covers with all my clothes still on. The ceiling fan spun around and around above me, and I watched the blades go in circles while my mind raced. Everything I'd been hiding for 3 years was out in the open now. My husband knew about the miscarriage. He knew why I'd been avoiding getting pregnant. And Lola's lie about the baby being his had exploded in the worst possible way. I rolled onto my side and pulled my knees up to my chest. The weight of all those secrets felt like it was crushing my ribs, making it hard to breathe right. I didn't sleep at all that night. Morning came with gray light coming through the bedroom window. I got up and went to the kitchen, moving on autopilot. I made coffee and poured 2 cups, then sat at the kitchen table waiting. My husband came out of the guest room about 15 minutes later. His hair was messy, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, but didn't drink any. The distance between us felt like miles, even though we were at the same table. He started explaining the whole testing process. He said he'd been going to this fertility clinic for the past month, giving samples and doing blood work. He said after our fight on the couch about kids, he started wondering if maybe something was wrong with him. He thought maybe if he could fix it, I'd stop making excuses and we could finally start a family. His voice got rough when he talked about getting the first results back and having to do 2 more rounds of testing to confirm. I asked if the results could be wrong, if maybe there was a mistake somewhere. He shook his head and said they tested 3 separate samples, and every single one showed the same thing. No sperm. Nothing that could make a baby. I told him I wanted to start therapy. The words came out before I really thought about them, but once I said them out loud, I knew it was true. I said I needed help dealing with the miscarriage grief I never processed, that I couldn't keep carrying it around alone anymore. He looked at me for the first time that morning and nodded slow. He said he thought that was a good idea. His face was still hurt and closed off, but something in his eyes looked a little less angry. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and left for work without saying anything else. As soon as he was gone, I grabbed my phone and called my insurance company. I sat on hold for 12 minutes listening to boring music before someone finally picked up. I explained I needed to find a counselor who specialized in pregnancy loss, and the lady on the phone clicked around on her computer for a while. She gave me 3 names and numbers. I called the first one right away and got an answering machine. The second one had a receptionist who said they weren't taking new patients. The third one answered and had an opening next week. I booked it before I could change my mind. That evening, I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand for probably 10 minutes before I finally opened my texts and found Lola's name. I typed out a message telling her not to contact me until she was honest about who the father might be, and until she got proper prenatal care. I said I needed space to process everything that happened. My thumb hovered over the send button for a few seconds, then I pressed it. The message showed as delivered right away. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, showing she was typing back. Then a bunch of angry face emojis filled my screen. The red mad faces and the purple devil ones. After that, nothing. The dots disappeared, and she went totally silent. The next day, he came home from work at 3 in the afternoon instead of his usual 6. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I heard his car pull into the driveway. My stomach twisted. He walked in looking tired, his tie loose around his neck and his work bag hanging heavy on his shoulder. He dropped the bag by the door and sat down in the chair across from me. We didn't say anything for a minute. Then he started talking. He said it began 2 months ago, right after our fight about kids on the same couch. He said he drove around angry and hurt and ended up at some bar downtown. Lola was there drinking alone. She looked sad, he said. And when she saw him, she waved him over. They talked for hours about nothing important, just venting about life and stress and feeling stuck. He said her attention felt good after weeks of me pulling away. One conversation led to another, then to late-night texts, then to meeting up when I thought he was at the gym. His voice got quiet when he described how lonely he'd been, and how Lola made him feel wanted again. I sat there listening to every word, my hands clenched tight in my lap. When he finished, I asked to see his phone records. I needed to know everything, needed to see proof of what he was telling me. He didn't argue or make excuses. He just pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and handed it over. I scrolled through his text messages with Lola going back 2 months. The early ones were casual, friendly check-ins asking how each other's day went. Then they got more personal. She'd text him late at night saying she couldn't sleep and missed having someone to talk to. He'd respond right away, even though I was asleep in the next room. The messages got flirtier over time, little jokes and compliments that crossed the line from friendship into something else. I saw texts where she said she felt so alone, and he said he understood that feeling. I saw messages where he told her she looked beautiful, and she sent back heart emojis. The call log showed hours of phone conversations I never knew about, some lasting past midnight. My hands shook as I kept scrolling, but I made myself look at all of it. When I handed his phone back, I told him he needed to move to the guest room. He nodded without fighting it. He got up and went to our bedroom, came back with an armful of clothes and his toothbrush and face wash from the bathroom. Watching him carry his stuff down the hall made everything feel more real. We were separating inside our own house. The guest room door closed, and I sat alone in the living room feeling the empty space where my husband used to be. The next morning, I went to work but couldn't focus on anything. My boss gave me a project with a deadline for end of day, and I stared at my computer screen for an hour without typing a single word. Every time I tried to concentrate, my mind went back to those text messages and the timeline my husband laid out. I kept making mistakes on simple tasks I'd done 100 times before. By lunch, I knew I couldn't keep pretending I was okay. I opened my email and typed a message to my supervisor, Elena. I kept it short, just that I was dealing with a family emergency and needed to take a mental health day. I knew this might hurt my chances at the promotion I'd been working toward for months, but I also knew I'd mess up worse if I tried to push through. Elena responded within 10 minutes saying to take the time I needed and we'd talk when I got back. I packed up my stuff and drove home, feeling guilty about leaving work, but also relieved to not have to pretend anymore. The rest of the week dragged by in a blur of awkward dinners and sleeping alone. My husband and I barely talked except for necessary things like who was doing laundry or what to make for dinner. On Friday, I had my first appointment with the counselor I'd found, a woman named Everly who specialized in pregnancy loss. Her office was in a small building near the hospital, decorated with soft colors and comfortable chairs. I sat down and she asked me to tell her what brought me in. For 50 minutes, I talked about the miscarriage 3 years ago, how I found out I was pregnant and lost the baby in the same week, how I blamed myself and never told my husband. Everly listened without interrupting or looking shocked. When I finished, she said my secrecy came from trying to protect myself from more pain, but it built a wall between me and my husband that neither of us knew how to get through. She said grief doesn't go away just because you don't talk about it just finds other ways to show up. Hearing her explain it like that made something click in my head. That weekend, my husband told me over dinner that he'd scheduled an appointment with a urologist to confirm his test results. He said the fertility clinic recommended getting a second opinion to make sure the diagnosis was right, and to see if there were any treatment options. I could see hope and fear mixed together on his face as he talked about wanting real answers. He kept twisting his napkin in his hands while he explained what the doctor would check for. I told him I thought that was a good idea and asked when the appointment was. He said next Thursday afternoon. Early the next week, I got a long text from Lola. She said she needed to be honest with me about something. She admitted she'd slept with someone else once or twice during what she called a rough time in her life. She didn't say who it was or when it happened. She just said she was confused and scared and didn't know what to do. Reading her vague confession made me angrier than if she'd just told me the whole truth. She was still hiding things, still trying to control what I knew. I texted back right away. I told her she needed to see a doctor for prenatal care and think about paternity testing once the baby was born. I kept my message short and factual, no emotion or sympathy. She responded fast, saying I was being cold when she needed support from her best friend. I stared at that message for a while, then put my phone down without replying. The next day at work, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a voice memo from my husband. I waited until my lunch break to listen to it. His voice sounded thick and emotional as he described the first time he kissed Lola. He said it happened in his car after he left our house angry one night. They'd met at a coffee shop to talk, and when he walked her to her car, she leaned in and kissed him. He said he should have pulled away, but he didn't. He said he felt guilty immediately, but also felt wanted for the first time in months. Hearing him describe it in detail hurt worse than I expected, but I also heard real guilt in his voice, real confusion about how he let things go that far. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and a memory came back to me. Right after my miscarriage 3 years ago, when I was crying and trying to decide whether to tell my husband what happened, Lola had said not to tell him. She said he'd just worry and hover over me and make everything harder. She said I needed space to heal without him getting all anxious and protective. At the time, I thought she was being a good friend, helping me avoid more pain. But now I realize she was encouraging the exact secrecy that damaged my marriage. She wanted me to keep it hidden. I wondered if she'd done that on purpose, if she'd wanted to keep me isolated and separate from my husband even back then. The next week, I sat in the OB/GYN's waiting room filling out paperwork about my medical history. I checked the box for previous pregnancy and wrote miscarriage in the notes section. My hands shook a little as I handed the clipboard back to the receptionist. When the doctor called me in, she looked over my forms and asked me to explain what happened 3 years ago. I told her about finding out I was pregnant and losing the baby within the same week. She nodded and said that kind of early loss is more common than people realize. I asked if it meant something was wrong with me. She explained that most first trimester miscarriages happen because of random genetic problems with that specific pregnancy, not because of something the mother did or didn't do. She said having one miscarriage doesn't mean I'll have another one. The risk goes up slightly after multiple losses, but one loss is different. I asked about the fear I felt every time I thought about getting pregnant again. She said that was completely normal, and that many women who've experienced loss feel the same anxiety. She offered to refer me to a counselor who works specifically with pregnancy loss patients. I took the referral card and put it in my purse. The appointment didn't make my fear disappear, but hearing a doctor say my anxiety was normal made it feel less like a personal failure. That same afternoon, my husband texted me saying he got the results from his second semen analysis. He asked if I could meet him at home to talk about it. I left work early and found him sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him. He looked tired and sad. He slid the report across the table to me. The urologist had tested 3 separate samples over the past 2 weeks. All 3 showed azoospermia with 0 sperm detected. The doctor's notes said the condition appeared to be permanent and that treatment options were limited and expensive with low success rates. My husband stared at his hands while I read through the medical terminology. He said the urologist told him this meant he'd been infertile for years, probably since before we got married. The finality of it hit both of us hard. He couldn't be Lola's baby's father. There was no possibility, no room for doubt. I felt relief mixed with sadness for him. He'd been imagining a future with biological children his whole life, and now that door was completely closed. 2 days later, I agreed to meet Lola at a coffee shop near her apartment. I picked a public place because I didn't want to be alone with her. She showed up 10 minutes late wearing sunglasses, even though it was cloudy outside. We sat across from each other at a small table by the window. I told her I needed to set some boundaries going forward. She nodded and said she understood. I asked her directly who the other man was, the one she'd slept with besides my husband. Her face changed. She took off her sunglasses and looked at me with this careful expression. She said it was complicated and she wasn't ready to share that information yet. I felt anger rising in my chest. I told her she owed me honesty after everything that happened. She said some things were private and she needed to figure out what to do before involving other people. Her evasiveness made it clear she was still trying to control what everyone knew. She wanted to manage the story and avoid taking full responsibility. I stood up to leave. She grabbed my wrist and asked me not to tell anyone about her pregnancy yet. I pulled my hand away and walked out without answering. That night, she sent me a long text. She said if I didn't stop being cold to her, she'd tell all our mutual friends about how I hid my miscarriage from my husband for 3 years. She said people would understand why my husband turned to her for comfort if they knew how I'd been lying to him. The manipulation was so obvious it almost made me laugh. She was threatening to expose my secret as leverage to keep me quiet and compliant. I read the text 3 times and realized our friendship had never been as healthy as I thought. She'd always found ways to keep me dependent on her support and guilty for needing space. I didn't respond to her threat. Instead, I opened my journal and started writing. I made a list of things I needed to tell my husband about why I hid the miscarriage and what I was afraid of. I wrote down what I needed from him moving forward. Honesty even when it's hard. Space to process my feelings without pressure. Patience while I worked through my fear about pregnancy. Creating the structured plan made the huge conversation feel more manageable. I could see the specific points I wanted to make instead of just drowning in guilt and anxiety. The next morning, my husband came by the house to pack more clothes. He said the guest room arrangement felt too awkward, and he needed more space to think. He was going to stay on his friend's couch for a while. I watched him fill a larger bag with clothes from our closet. He took his toiletries from the bathroom and some books from the nightstand. Seeing him pack more than just a few days' worth of stuff made the separation feel more serious, more permanent. He paused at the door before leaving and said he'd call me in a few days. I nodded. The house felt too quiet after he left. 3 days later, I was eating lunch at my desk when the receptionist called my extension. She said someone was in the lobby asking for me and causing a disruption. I went downstairs and found Lola standing near the security desk. She was talking loudly and gesturing with her hands. She saw me and started walking toward me, saying we needed to talk right now. I told her this wasn't the time or place. She raised her voice and said I was abandoning her when she needed me most. Other people in the lobby turned to look at us. My supervisor, Elena, came out of the elevator and saw what was happening. She walked over and asked if everything was okay. Lola pointed at me and said I was being a terrible friend. Elena calmly asked Lola to leave the building. Lola argued for another minute before security escorted her out. Elena pulled me aside and said HR needed to document this incident. She said personal drama couldn't affect the professional environment, and this was a warning. I apologized and went back upstairs feeling embarrassed and angry. That evening, I sat on my couch with my laptop and started making a timeline. I wrote down the dates my husband admitted being with Lola based on his texts and voice memos. Then I calculated backward from when Lola said she got pregnant. If she was telling the truth about how far along she was, conception would have happened at least a week before my husband's first encounter with her. The math was clear. My husband's timeline didn't match up with when the baby was conceived. He was never a real candidate for paternity. I stared at the timeline on my screen and felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Lola had to know this. She had to know the dates didn't add up. So why did she announce the pregnancy to both of us like my husband was the father? While I sat there thinking, a memory came back to me. Last year, Lola invited me to happy hour with her coworkers several times. One of them was a guy named Bryce. He always sat next to Lola and they had this odd chemistry. Lots of inside jokes and casual touching. When I asked Lola about it once, she laughed and said they were just work friends. But I remembered the way he looked at her. I opened Facebook and searched for Lola's profile. I scrolled through her photos until I found pictures from those happy hours. There was Bryce in multiple photos, always standing close to Lola. I clicked on his profile and found his full name. I spent 20 minutes crafting a message asking if we could talk about Lola. I tried to keep it vague but urgent. My hands shook as I moved the cursor over the send button. I was about to open another layer of this situation and I had no idea what I'd find. I pressed send and closed my laptop. The next afternoon, I sat in Everly's office for my second session. She asked me to talk more about my relationship with Lola before the miscarriage. I explained how Lola always knew what to say to make me feel better, how I relied on her advice for everything, how I never made big decisions without checking with her first. Everly wrote something in her notebook and asked if I noticed a pattern in how I handled scary situations. I thought about it and realized I always looked for someone else to tell me what to do. With the miscarriage, I let Lola convince me to keep it secret. With my marriage problems, I avoided them completely instead of facing them. Everly said these patterns made sense as protection, but they also kept me stuck. Naming the behavior as codependency made it feel less like a character flaw and more like something I could actually work on. 2 days later, my husband called and asked if he could come by to talk. I said yes, and he showed up an hour later looking tired. He sat at the kitchen table and told me about his appointment with the urologist. The doctor asked about his medical history, and my husband remembered having mumps as a kid, around age 12. He'd been really sick for almost 2 weeks. The urologist explained that mumps can sometimes cause problems with fertility, especially if it happens after puberty starts. My husband's voice got quiet when he said the doctor mentioned treatments like surgery or hormone therapy, but they cost thousands of dollars and didn't always work. He said he felt like he was grieving something he never had, this future where he'd be a dad to biological kids. I listened without interrupting, and for the first time in months, I saw him being completely honest about his pain, instead of hiding it or getting angry. Before he left, my husband asked if he could pick up more of his clothes from the closet. I said that was fine and followed him upstairs. He packed a duffel bag with work shirts and jeans, moving slowly like he didn't really want to go. When he finished, he turned to me and said he was sorry. Not sorry with excuses or explanations, just sorry for hurting me and for lying and for sleeping with my best friend. He said he knew saying sorry didn't fix anything, but he wanted me to know he understood what he did was wrong. Then he said I could ask him anything about the affair, and he'd answer honestly, no matter how hard the question was. His willingness to be completely open felt different from all our other conversations. It felt like the first real connection we'd had since that fight on the couch months ago. That evening while I was making dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Lola. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. She'd sent an ultrasound photo, the black and white image showing a tiny blob that would become a baby. Her message said she was so scared about doing this alone, and she wished things were different between us. She said she knew I understood how scary pregnancy could be, and she really needed her best friend right now. Reading it made my chest feel tight. Part of me recognized the guilt trip for what it was, her trying to manipulate me into supporting her after everything she'd done. But I also heard real fear in her words. She was pregnant and alone and probably terrified, and some small part of me still cared about that, even though I was angry. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, I typed out a message saying I needed her to be honest about paternity and stop trying to make me feel guilty for having boundaries. I said I wouldn't have contact with her until she took real steps to figure out who the father was and stopped playing games with everyone's lives. I told her I hoped she got the support she needed, but it couldn't come from me right now. My finger shook a little when I hit send. Setting that boundary felt necessary, but it also felt sad, like officially ending a friendship that had been important to me for years. The next morning, I woke up to 3 text messages from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened them, I realized they were from Bryce. He said he got my Facebook message and he needed to tell me the truth. He admitted he'd hooked up with Lola several times over the past few months, usually after work events when they'd both been drinking. He said he was scared out of his mind about what this meant, and he didn't know what to do. His panic came through even in text form, lots of typos and incomplete sentences. I felt exhausted reading his messages. Another person who'd been lying and hiding things. Another layer of deception in this whole mess. Bryce sent another text an hour later after I didn't respond to the first ones. He said there was something else I needed to know. He told me he was in a relationship with someone named Stefan, and they'd been together for almost a year. He begged me not to tell anyone about his involvement with Lola, saying it would destroy his relationship and out him at work before he was ready. I sat on my couch holding my phone and feeling the weight of yet another person's secret. I was so tired of holding everyone's lies. The web of deception kept getting bigger and more complicated, and I just wanted someone to be honest without me having to drag the truth out of them. That afternoon, I was folding laundry when my phone rang with a call from Lola. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that I listened to later while sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot. Her voice sounded shaky and sad. She said she felt abandoned after my miscarriage even though she was the one who supported me through it. She said watching me pull away and seeing my husband get distant made her feel lonely too. She said she grabbed at my husband's attention because she needed someone to see her and care about her. Her attempt to justify the affair by claiming I hurt her first made anger flash hot in my chest. But underneath the anger, I also heard genuine pain in her voice. She was trying to explain herself, not just manipulate me, and that made everything feel more complicated. I called my husband that evening and asked if he'd be willing to try talking with a therapist present. I said we kept having conversations that exploded into fights or shut down into silence, and maybe having someone there to help us communicate would make it easier. He was quiet for a minute, then said he was willing to try. He sounded nervous, but also relieved, like he'd been wanting to suggest the same thing but didn't know how. We agreed to look for a couples therapist who specialized in infidelity and loss. Neither of us said anything about whether we were trying to save the marriage or just trying to end it peacefully. We both just knew we needed help talking to each other. I spent the next day calling different therapy offices and explaining my situation to receptionists. Most places had waiting lists that were weeks long. Finally, I found a therapist named Harmony Woods, who had an opening for a consultation call the following week. The receptionist said Harmony specialized in couples dealing with infidelity and grief. I booked the call and texted my husband the details. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. The consultation call happened on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone on speaker, while Harmony explained how couples therapy worked. She said the first session wouldn't be about fixing everything or making big decisions. It would be about creating space for both of us to talk honestly without things exploding. She explained ground rules about respect and listening and taking breaks if things got too heated. Her voice was calm and professional, and hearing her talk about the process made me feel like maybe we could actually do this without everything falling apart. The following week, I drove to the office building where Harmony worked and sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to calm my nerves. My husband pulled into the parking lot and parked 3 spots away from me. We walked into the building separately without speaking and met in the waiting room where we sat on opposite ends of a small couch. Harmony opened her office door and welcomed us inside with a warm smile that didn't feel fake or forced. She had us sit in 2 chairs facing each other with her off to the side. She explained we'd start by each sharing what we hoped to get from therapy without interrupting each other. My husband went first and said he wanted to understand why I'd hidden so much from him and whether we could rebuild trust. When it was my turn, I said I needed to figure out if I could forgive the affair and whether staying married was what I actually wanted or just what felt safe. Harmony asked my husband to clarify the timeline of his relationship with Lola because she said specifics would help us move forward. He took a deep breath and told us he and Lola were physically intimate only twice, both times happening in the past 2 months. The first time was 6 weeks ago in his car after they'd been drinking at a bar. The second time was 3 weeks ago at her apartment when I thought he was at the gym. Hearing him say it out loud with actual dates and locations made my stomach twist. But I also appreciated that he wasn't trying to minimize what happened or make excuses. After he finished, Harmony asked how I felt hearing those details. I said it hurt, but I'd rather know the truth than keep wondering and imagining worse scenarios. She nodded and said honesty was painful, but necessary for any kind of healing to happen. Near the end of the session, I brought up something that had been weighing on me. I told Harmony about Bryce and how he'd admitted to sleeping with Lola around the same time as my husband. I said I kept thinking about whether I should tell Stefan that his partner had been involved with Lola too. Harmony leaned forward and asked why I felt responsible for managing that situation. I didn't have a good answer except that keeping secrets felt wrong after everything that had happened. She helped me see that inserting myself into their relationship wasn't my job, and I needed to focus on my own healing instead of trying to fix everyone else's problems. She said I'd been carrying other people's truths for too long, and it was time to put that burden down. The session ended with Harmony giving us both homework assignments about identifying our needs and boundaries. Walking back to our separate cars felt lonely, but also clearer somehow. At work the next day, I stared at my computer screen trying to focus on a project proposal that was due by 5. My boss Elena had been counting on me to deliver this presentation for an important client meeting. But every time I tried to write a coherent sentence, my mind drifted back to therapy, or my husband's confession, or Lola's pregnancy. By 3 in the afternoon, I'd only written 2 paragraphs and they didn't make any sense. I kept rereading the same lines without processing what they said. At 4:30, Elena stopped by my desk and asked how the proposal was coming. I looked at her and felt my face get hot with shame. I admitted I hadn't finished it and didn't think I could pull it together in 30 minutes. She closed her eyes for a second, then asked me to come to her office. Once we were sitting down, she said she'd noticed my performance slipping over the past few weeks. She wasn't angry, but she looked concerned and disappointed. She told me the promotion I'd been working toward was postponed until I could get back on track. She said whatever was happening in my personal life needed to be dealt with because it was affecting my work too much. I apologized and promised to do better, but we both knew it was an empty promise right now. She suggested I consider taking some personal days to sort things out. I nodded and left her office feeling like I was failing at everything. 3 days later, I sat in Everly's office for my 3rd individual therapy session. She'd asked me to think about what I wanted to say to my husband regarding the miscarriage and my years of fear and silence. I pulled out my phone where I'd been writing notes and read them out loud. My voice shook as I described finding out I was pregnant and feeling excited for about 2 days before the cramping started. I told her about going to the emergency room alone and having a doctor confirm the miscarriage with an ultrasound that showed nothing but an empty space. I explained how I convinced myself it was my fault somehow, and that telling my husband would only hurt him too. Everly listened without interrupting, then asked if we could practice what I'd say to him. She had me pretend she was my husband and deliver the same words while looking at her. It felt awkward at first, but she coached me through it. She pointed out when I started making excuses or downplaying my feelings. We practiced until I could say the whole thing without apologizing for my emotions or trying to protect him from the truth. By the end of the session, I felt raw, but also ready. She said I didn't have to have this conversation right away, but I should have it before our next couples session with Harmony. The following afternoon, I met Lola at a coffee shop halfway between our houses. We'd agreed to exchange belongings we'd left at each other's places over the years. I brought a box with her books and a sweater and some kitchen stuff she'd stored at my house. She handed me a bag with my favorite blanket and some photos and a necklace I'd forgotten at her apartment months ago. We sat at a corner table and didn't talk for a minute. She looked tired in a way that went beyond just physical exhaustion. Her face was puffy and her eyes had dark circles under them. She finally said she was scared about being a single mother and didn't know how to do this alone. I felt a flicker of compassion despite everything that had happened. I told her she'd figure it out because she didn't have another choice. She asked if we could ever be friends again someday. I said I didn't know, but right now I needed distance and she needed to focus on her baby and getting her life together. She nodded and looked like she might cry, but didn't. We finished our coffee in silence and left without hugging or making plans to talk again. That evening, Bryce sent me a text saying he'd decided to contact Lola privately and offer to take a paternity test. He said he couldn't keep hiding from the situation and needed to know if he was going to be a father. His message was short, but I could feel the anxiety behind the words. I texted back saying I thought he was doing the right thing and that Lola needed to face reality. He thanked me and said he'd let me know what happened. His willingness to step up and deal with the consequences gave me a weird sense of relief. At least one person was finally being honest and taking responsibility. 2 days later, Lola sent me a message confirming she'd agreed to do a non-invasive prenatal paternity test with Bryce once she was far enough along in the pregnancy. Her text was only 3 sentences with no extra explanation or emotional appeals. She said the test could be done after 9 weeks, and she'd schedule it as soon as possible. Then she said she'd send me the results when they came back. The lack of manipulation or drama in her message felt like actual progress. Maybe she was finally understanding that actions had consequences, and she couldn't charm or cry her way out of this situation. The next week, my husband and I met with a mediator to draft a temporary separation agreement. The mediator's office was in a boring building with gray carpet and fluorescent lights that made everything feel depressing. We sat across from each other at a conference table while the mediator asked questions about our finances and living arrangements. My husband would continue paying the mortgage on our house while he stayed with his friend. We'd split credit card bills and keep our bank accounts separate for now. The mediator typed everything into a document and printed copies for us to review. The whole process felt businesslike and sad. Signing the papers made our crisis feel official and documented instead of just something we were going through. We left the building without talking and drove away in opposite directions. A few days after that, my husband called and said he had an update from his urologist appointment. He was continuing treatment and trying to understand his diagnosis better. He also mentioned he'd started researching sperm donors and adoption options on his own time. His voice sounded heavy when he talked about it, like he was processing something painful. I could tell he was grieving the idea of biological fatherhood and what that meant for his future. I respected that he was doing this work privately, instead of making it my problem to solve or my responsibility to comfort him through. We were both dealing with our own losses separately, and that felt appropriate right now. That same week, Everly gave me information about a pregnancy loss support group that met every week at a community center. She said hearing other people's stories might help me feel less isolated in my grief. I was nervous about going, but I showed up to the first meeting anyway. The room was small with folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were 6 other women there, plus a facilitator. Everyone introduced themselves and shared brief versions of their lost stories. One woman had 3 miscarriages before finally having a successful pregnancy. Another woman lost twins at 20 weeks. A third woman had a stillbirth at full term. Hearing their experiences made me realize how many different ways people carried this kind of grief. Some of them cried while talking, and others spoke in flat voices like they'd told the story so many times it didn't hurt anymore. When it was my turn, I gave the basic facts without going into detail about my marriage situation. After the meeting ended, a few women came up to me and said they were glad I'd come. Walking to my car, I felt less alone than I had in 3 years. Our second session with Harmony happened 3 days after the support group meeting. My husband and I sat on opposite ends of the same couch in her office, leaving space between us that felt both necessary and sad. Harmony asked if there was anything specific we needed to address today, and I knew this was the moment to tell the whole truth. I started talking about finding out I was pregnant 3 years ago and how excited I felt for about 2 days before the cramping started. I described going to the bathroom and seeing the blood and knowing immediately what was happening. My voice shook when I explained how I sat on the bathroom floor crying while my husband was at work, and how I cleaned everything up before he got home so he'd never know. My husband's face went pale as I talked, and when I got to the part about being too scared and ashamed to tell him, tears started running down his cheeks. He asked why I didn't trust him with something so important, and I said I thought I was protecting him from pain, but I was really just protecting myself from having to face it. We both cried in Harmony's office, sitting with grief that should have been shared 3 years ago instead of carried alone. Harmony let us sit in the silence for a few minutes before asking what we needed from each other right now. My husband said he wished I'd told him, but he understood why I didn't, and I said I was sorry for all the lies and excuses that came after. We talked about how the miscarriage created a wall between us that neither of us knew how to climb over, and how that wall made space for other people and other mistakes. Harmony suggested we pause any discussions about having children and focus on individual healing for now. The suggestion felt like relief washing over me instead of loss or failure. My husband nodded and said he needed to figure out who he was separate from the future he'd imagined, and I understood exactly what he meant. We left the session feeling raw but slightly less broken than when we'd arrived. That evening, Lola sent me a text saying her paternity test was scheduled for next week, and she was scared of losing everyone's support if Bryce turned out to be the father. Her message had none of the usual manipulation or drama, just plain vulnerability that felt more genuine than anything she'd sent before. I texted back saying I hoped the test went smoothly, but I was maintaining my boundary about limited contact. She replied with a simple okay and didn't push for more, which surprised me. The next morning, Bryce sent me a message confirming he'd agreed to cover all the costs of the paternity test and asking me not to tell anyone else about his involvement until results came back. His focus on discretion frustrated me because it felt like he was more worried about his reputation than taking responsibility, but I also understood he was trying to protect his relationship with Stefan. I told him I wouldn't say anything to anyone and left it at that. 2 days later, I had to have a difficult conversation with Elena at work. I went to her office during lunch and explained I needed to step back from the promotion track for now while I dealt with personal issues. She looked disappointed but said she understood, and asked if there was anything the company could do to support me. I thanked her and said I just needed time and space to get my life sorted out. Walking back to my desk, I felt the professional cost of this crisis, even though I knew stepping back was the right choice for my mental health. That afternoon, my husband forwarded me a text he'd sent to Lola saying he wouldn't have any further contact with her regardless of the paternity results. The message was clear and firm without being mean, and he'd copied me so I could see he was being accountable. His boundary felt like real change instead of just punishment or anger. The following day, I called Lola to have one last boundary-setting conversation. I told her our friendship was over and I wouldn't be involved in any triangulation between her and my husband. She argued at first, saying I was abandoning her when she needed support, but I stayed calm and repeated that I had to protect my own healing. Eventually, she stopped arguing and just sounded defeated, but not angry when she said she understood. We hung up and I felt sad but also clear about what I needed. A week and a half later, Lola forwarded me the paternity test results without any commentary or explanation. The lab report confirmed Bryce was the father with a probability higher than 99%. I sat in my car reading the document and felt relief mixed with sadness for everyone involved in this mess. I forwarded the results to my husband so he could have closure too, and he texted back thanking me. That weekend, my husband and I met at a park near our house to talk about our future. We sat on a bench watching people walk their dogs and kids play on the swings. He said he wanted to continue our trial separation while we both stayed in therapy, and I agreed that felt right. The conversation was tender but realistic, as we acknowledged we didn't know yet if our marriage could recover, but we were both willing to try. We talked about what individual healing looked like for each of us and agreed to check in every couple weeks instead of avoiding each other completely. Walking back to our separate cars felt lonely, but also like we were finally being honest about where we actually were, instead of pretending everything was fine. 3 days after that, Lola sent me a text that felt different from all her previous messages. She took full responsibility for her actions and said explicitly she wasn't asking for anything from me. She wrote that she was starting therapy and building a support system that didn't depend on people she'd hurt, which sounded like actual growth instead of manipulation. I didn't respond, but I saved the message because it felt important to acknowledge that people could change even after doing terrible things. 2 days after saving Lola's message, I sat down with my husband at a coffee shop to talk about our living situation. We'd been in limbo with him crashing on his friend's couch and me rattling around in our house alone. He said he wanted to find a short-term sublet closer to his work, so he could have his own space without feeling like he was imposing on anyone. I told him I wanted to stay in the house because moving felt like too much change on top of everything else we were dealing with. He nodded and said that made sense and pulled out his phone to show me a few rental listings he'd already looked at. We split the coffee bill and walked to our separate cars without hugging or touching, which felt sad but also appropriate for where we actually were. The next week, he signed a lease on a furnished studio apartment and moved his remaining clothes and toiletries out of the guest room. Watching him pack the last box and carry it to his car made the separation feel more real and permanent, even though we kept saying it was temporary. We met with our lawyer to extend the separation agreement for another 3 months and update the financial arrangements now that he had his own rent to pay. The paperwork felt clinical and businesslike as we initialed each section and signed at the bottom. Neither of us brought up divorce, even though the lawyer asked if we wanted to discuss that option. We both said no at the same time, and then looked at each other with something that might have been hope or might have been just exhaustion. I kept going to therapy with Everly every week, and my husband continued seeing his own therapist, whose name I didn't know. We still had occasional couples sessions with Harmony where we practiced being honest about our feelings without attacking each other or shutting down. The progress felt slow and uncertain, but it also felt more real than the fake harmony we'd maintained for years. My brother Ridge checked in on me regularly without being pushy or trying to fix everything. I'm not healed and my marriage isn't saved, but I'm finally living honestly instead of hiding behind fear and secrets. I have a therapist who helps me process grief, and a brother who gives me space to figure things out, and a husband who's doing his own work, rather than expecting me to carry everything. The future is uncertain, but for the first time in 3 years, I'm not running from the truth. And that's my side of it. But what about you? Would you have handled it the same way? I love hearing how you all think, so drop your version in the comments. You always bring the best insights.